All right, so let's dive right into this. You sent over some seriously interesting stuff about English literature.
Yeah.
After the monarchy, got restored in 1660,
Uh-huh.
a real turning point in England, right?
Big time, yeah.
We've got this PDF characteristics of the Restoration literature, and it looks like it's going to give us a
Yeah.
really good picture of just how much things changed.
It really does.
Yeah.
It was a complete 180. I mean, after all those years under the Puritans,
Yeah.
the return of Charles II from France didn't just shift the political landscape.
Right.
It really shook up the whole social scene,
Mhm.
moral compass, you name it.
Yeah, the whole vibe totally changed.
And of course, literature followed suit.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, what we're really trying to understand is
Good.
what are the key features of this Restoration period in English literature?
Yeah.
Why was it so different from what came before?
Okay.
And what kind of lasting impact did it have?
Gotcha.
So we're going to be looking at poetry, drama, and prose, pulling out the most important bits.
Yeah. Sounds good. And it's worth remembering that this period, we're talking roughly 1660 to 1700.
Uh-huh.
It's often called the Age of Dryden.
Right.
He was so influential, really dominated the scene.
Yeah, okay, so the big question we're tackling today is how did the return of the king after the Puritan era completely reshape the literary landscape?
It's a great question.
It sounds like things swung pretty drastically in the other direction.
They really did. It was a very deliberate and forceful rejection of almost everything the Puritans stood for.
Yeah.
I mean, the monarchy was back.
Right.
Charles II had been living it up in France, soaking up all that, more liberal atmosphere. Some might even say decadent.
Right, right.
And he brought all those influences back with him.
Okay, so it wasn't just a change of leadership. It was like a national mood swing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And with the Puritans out of the picture, there was a huge backlash against all their strict moral and social rules,
Yeah.
all those restrictions, and that intense discipline suddenly gone.
Out the window.
Yeah, the PDF you sent actually describes it as a
Yeah.
wave of licentiousness and frivolity washing over the country.
Wow. Quite a change, huh? So Charles II and his crew weren't exactly looking to follow in the footsteps of,
Yeah, not at all.
the Elizabethans with their love of country and adventure,
Nope.
or the Puritans with all their moral intensity.
They were done with all that.
Were they consciously rejecting those older English literary models?
Very much so. They actually turned towards French writers.
Really?
The source even says they were imitating their vices.
Oh, wow. Okay, so what happened to that old literary spirit, that Elizabethan passion for patriotism and adventure?
Yeah.
The Puritan focus on morality and freedom?
It seems like it just faded into the background. It became a thing of the past.
Really?
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the early Restoration literature couldn't really compare to the heights of the Elizabethans or Milton or even some of those minor Puritan writers.
That's surprising, isn't it? You'd think all this newfound freedom would lead to, like, a burst of creativity.
You would, but it seems like initially they were more focused on establishing a new tone, a clean break from what came before.
Okay.
But eventually they did develop their own distinct characteristics.
Yeah.
The source highlights two key contributions: realism and a tendency towards preciseness in language.
Okay, let's unpack those. So realism first.
Right.
The document mentions it started out being kind of ugly.
Yeah.
What did they mean by that?
Well, early on, this new realism involved portraying society and the court, warts and all.
Uh-huh.
And it seems there were a lot of warts. They were more interested in exposing the vices than celebrating the virtues.
Okay.
So it resulted in what they call coarse and inferior literature.
So less about noble heroes and more about...
Yeah, much more about the scandalous goings-on in the court,
Okay.
moral failings of the elite.
So kind of a gritty reality check, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the source points out that later on, this realism became more balanced. They started depicting human life with both its good and bad sides, exploring both the inner world and the outward actions.
That makes sense. So they moved beyond just reacting against Puritanism and actually started to observe and reflect on the world around them.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so what about this tendency towards preciseness?
Right, so this was a big shift in writing style.
Yeah.
This emphasis on directness and simplicity was a direct reaction against the more elaborate and often exaggerated styles of the Elizabethans and the Puritans.
So less flowery language, less Latin and classical allusions.
Exactly. They were going for clarity over ornamentation.
Uh-huh.
And this was partly influenced by what was happening in France with the emphasis on reason and logic.
Okay.
So you see a lot of short, clear sentences getting straight to the point.
So more logic, less poetic flourish.
In a way, yes.
Okay.
And, the Royal Society,
Yeah.
the newly formed Royal Society, they actually encouraged their members to adopt a close, naked, natural way of speaking and writing.
Wow. Naked. That's pretty
Yeah.
strong.
They were aiming for what they call mathematical plainness.
Okay, so this wasn't just about simple language. It was about reflecting this new scientific mindset.
Exactly.
Observation and clear communication.
Yeah.
Mathematical plainness. That's quite a contrast to some of the earlier prose we've looked at.
It really is. And John Dryden, he really embraced this new ideal,
Okay.
both in his prose and in his poetry, where he favored the heroic couplet.
Right, the heroic couplet, those rhyming pairs of lines.
Yes, exactly. Very concise and controlled, perfect for delivering those witty or satirical points.
Okay.
And under Dryden's influence, this precise, formal, and elegant style became known as the classical style.
Uh-huh.
And it really dominated English literature for over a century.
Okay, so Dryden was key in shaping not just what people wrote about, but how they wrote it.
Absolutely.
All right, let's talk about his poetry then. The source really highlights satire and the heroic couplet as being central.
For sure. Dryden was a master of the heroic couplet, and satire was a big part of Restoration poetry.
And you see that realism too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Very grounded.
Okay.
And, in his early work, you can still see some traces of those metaphysical poets
Uh-huh.
with their, intellectual wit and surprising comparisons.
Right.
But Dryden later moved away from that towards a much clearer, more forceful style.
Okay.
This is really the foundation of what became known as neoclassical poetry in England.
All right, and the source breaks down his poetry into three categories: political satires,
Yes.
doctrinal poems, and the fables.
Right.
Let's start with the political stuff.
Right.
Absalom and Achitophel sounds pretty interesting.
It is. It's considered one of the most significant political satires in English.
Okay.
He's defending King Charles II against the Earl of Shaftesbury,
Uh-huh.
who is represented as this character, Achitophel.
Okay, clever.
It's really praised for its character studies.
Yeah.
Not just Shaftesbury, but also the Duke of Buckingham, who appears as the flamboyant Zimri.
Gotcha.
The Medal is another one,
Mm-hmm.
also aimed at Shaftesbury, and there's even a personal attack on another writer, Thomas Shadwell, in there.
Oh, wow, he didn't hold back.
It's like 17th century political cartoons.
Yeah, using wit as a weapon.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the doctrinal poems, Religio Laici and The Hind and the Panther?
Okay, so these are more theological and argumentative.
Okay.
What's interesting is that Religio Laici defends the Anglican Church,
Mm-hmm.
and Dryden was Protestant at the time.
Okay.
Then he converts to Catholicism and writes The Hind and the Panther,
Right.
a really strong defense of Catholic doctrine.
So he was pretty good at arguing in verse, regardless of his own religious beliefs.
It shows his skill in constructing arguments and presenting a persuasive case.
Wow, like he could argue any side of an issue as long as he could do it in rhyme.
Seems that way.
Okay, and lastly, the fables, these were narrative poems from his later years, right?
They were, yeah, and they're considered some of the best examples of verse storytelling in English.
Okay.
Palamon and Arcite, which is based on Chaucer's Knight's Tale, is a good example.
Uh-huh.
The source also mentions Annus Mirabilis, showing his narrative power,
Mm-hmm.
and Alexander's Feast as a top-notch ode.
Okay, so when we look at Dryden's poetry overall, how well does it represent the Restoration period?
The source says it really embodies all the key features.
Yeah.
You see that formalism, the intellectual precision,
Yeah.
the skill in argumentation,
Uh-huh.
and that grounded realism.
Right.
But it also points out that there's a certain lack of,
What?
that poetic inspiration, that deep spiritual fervor that you might find in earlier poetry.
Okay, so a trade-off in a less emotional depth than spiritual exploration, but more intellectual engagement and wit.
Yeah, you could say that.
All right, let's move on to drama. The source reminds us that the theaters, which had been closed down in 1642 by the Puritans,
Right.
reopened in 1660.
A big moment.
That must have had a huge impact on the plays that were being written and performed.
It did. Restoration drama took a completely different direction, partly because of that long break,
Uh-huh.
and partly because of the changes in society.
Right.
This new era was all about prose, intellect realism,
Yeah.
and a more critical, often cynical view of life.
Very different from the poetic and imaginative dramas of earlier periods.
Yes, very much so.
And the audience for these plays changed too, right?
The common people still influenced by Puritanism.
Yeah.
They weren't really interested in going to the theater.
So the playwrights were writing for a different crowd.
They were writing for the aristocratic class,
Okay.
who were known for being Fashionable, frivolous, cynical, and sophisticated.
Quite a change from the Elizabethan era where plays had a much broader appeal.
Yeah, it shows how literature reflects the social structures of the time.
So when these plays talked about actual life, they really meant the life of the aristocracy.
Exactly. And the most popular form of drama that emerged was the comedy of manners,
Okay.
which focused on portraying the social interactions of the upper class.
Right, all that witty banter and intrigue.
Exactly.
The source quotes Shelley describing this type of comedy as lacking ideal universality and being full of malignity, sarcasm, and contempt.
Yeah, he wasn't a fan.
Sounds like he had some strong opinions.
He saw it as a form of comedy that lacked genuine humor
Okay.
and relied on laughter at the expense of others.
Uh-huh.
He also mentions the issue of obscenity,
Right.
which was pretty prevalent in these plays.
Okay, so the source lists a bunch of key playwrights: Dryden, Etheridge, Wycherley, Vanbrugh, Farquhar, and Congreve.
Yes.
Who really stands out among them?
Well, they all made important contributions, but William Congreve is often considered the most gifted.
Okay.
He wrote all his best plays before he even turned 30.
Wow.
Love, For Love, and The Way of the World being the most famous.
All right, and what made Congreve so special?
His dialogue, it's incredibly witty.
Okay.
The source praises his prose style, calling his sentences balanced, polished, and sharp.
Perfect for delivering those witty lines.
Exactly. He really elevated the art of witty banter in English drama.
So even though these plays might not have had the same broad appeal as Shakespeare,
Sure.
they're still valuable as social documents, right?
Absolutely. They give us a fascinating glimpse into the morals and manners of the upper classes. And despite the criticism they've received over the years, there's been a renewed appreciation for Restoration comedy.
Interesting.
People recognize their wit and their insights into human behavior.
Okay, let's move on to prose then.
Right.
The source says that the Restoration period holds its head much higher in prose than it does in poetry and drama,
Yeah.
though it didn't quite reach the heights of some of the masters who came before or after.
That's true, but it made some significant advancements in its own way.
In what way?
It established itself as a very effective way of clearly and precisely expressing all sorts of ideas and feelings.
So less about grand rhetoric, more about straightforward communication.
Exactly.
Okay.
For the first time, you have a prose style that's suitable for plain storytelling, logical argumentation, dealing with complex subjects, and handling practical matters.
Right.
The elaborate Elizabethan prose just wasn't practical for simple storytelling. Yeah. And the styles of writers like Bacon, Milton, and Brown, they couldn't really be adapted to things like scientific writing, history, politics, philosophy, or the novel.
So the changing needs of society drove this shift in prose style.
Absolutely. And once again, John Dryden was a key figure.
Of course.
His essay of dramatic poesy is seen as a model of this new approach.
Okay.
Plain simple and exact, avoiding any unnecessary embellishment.
And his later works like The Fables also exemplify this style.
They do. The source describes his prose as being correct, but not dull, easy, but not careless, forcible, but not unnatural, eloquent, but not overly dramatic, and graceful, but not lacking vigor.
So a real emphasis on balance, clarity, and functionality.
Exactly.
It might not have been as flashy as earlier prose, but it was definitely more versatile.
It was. And the source mentions other writers who were influenced by Dryden, like Sir William Temple, John Tillotson, and George Savile.
Right.
They all adopted this more straightforward style.
And the Royal Society played a role in promoting this new style too, didn't they?
They did. Thomas Spratt's History of the Royal Society is mentioned as a key text.
Okay.
He argues for a more popular style of writing, free from what he calls a vicious abundance of phrase.
Okay.
And the Royal Society itself encouraged its members to write in a close, natural way.
Interesting how a scientific organization had such an influence on literary style.
It is, isn't it?
Now, the source also highlights John Bunyan as a major prose writer of the period,
Yes.
comparing him to Milton in the context of Puritanism.
Right, so Bunyan is considered the greatest storyteller to come out of Puritanism,
Okay.
just as Milton was its greatest poet.
And he's also seen as a precursor to the novel.
He is primarily because of The Pilgrim's Progress.
Right. The Pilgrim's Progress, a true classic.
It is.
The source compares Bunyan's aim in that book to Milton's aim in Paradise Lost.
Yes, so Milton wanted to justify the ways of God to men.
Right?
And Bunyan wanted to guide people toward salvation
Uh-huh.
through this simple but powerful parable
Okay.
with relatable characters and engaging events.
So both writers shared this deep religious faith
They did?
and a powerful imagination, even though they weren't entirely comfortable with fiction.
That's right.
And The Pilgrim's Progress has resonated with readers for centuries, even those who don't share its religious message.
It has, the source says, it's because of its literary artistry.
Okay.
The compelling narrative, the interesting characters, the vivid descriptions, the clear direction of the story, and Bunyan's own voice shining through.
There's that famous quote from Dr. Johnson about it, too.
Oh, yeah. He said, "This is the great merit of the book, that the most cultivated man cannot find anything to praise more highly, and the child knows nothing more amusing."
High praise indeed.
It is.
And the source argues that The Pilgrim's Progress has all the basic elements of a novel.
It does a good story, interesting characters, engaging dialogue, vivid descriptions, a clear narrative arc, and a distinct authorial voice.
So all the ingredients were there.
They were.
Bunyan also wrote other works like Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners and The Holy War.
He did. Grace Abounding is his spiritual autobiography.
Okay.
The Holy War is another allegory, but his characters aren't as memorable.
Uh-huh.
And he also wrote The Life and Death of Mr. Badman,
Right.
which is more of a realistic portrayal of low life.
Okay, and it's interesting that Bunyan's prose style was so influenced by the Bible.
It was.
Especially considering he wasn't a scholar.
He was an unlettered tinker.
Really?
But his knowledge of the Bible was deep,
Uh-huh.
and his writing reflects that direct, powerful style.
Okay.
He wrote from the heart with sincerity and conviction.
And that's what gives his works their lasting power.
Exactly.
So as we've seen, this Restoration period really shook things up in English literature.
He did.
The Puritans were out, the French influence was in,
Yeah.
and it led to some really interesting changes.
It's fascinating to see how the social and political climate of the time directly shaped the literature.
Yeah, you see this shift towards realism and precision, a focus on wit and manners in drama,
Yes.
and the emergence of a prose style that could handle both scientific discourse and the beginnings of the novel.
It's a great example of how culture and creativity are intertwined.
Exactly. This deep dive has given us a good understanding of not just this specific era,
Right.
but also the broader relationship between society and art.
Definitely.
What happens when the old order is overthrown?
Yeah.
What new forms emerge?
It makes you think.
What gets lost and what gets gained?
It really does, and it raises a thought-provoking question for our listeners.
Okay.
How might the societal shifts happening in our world today be influencing the stories we tell and the ways we tell them?
That's something to ponder.
It is.
Thanks for bringing this fascinating material to the table.
You're welcome.